This is the Doorstep. Sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. Featuring Nicholas Gvosdev, Tatiana Serafin, and Francisco de Santibañes. This episode was recorded on October 28th, 2021.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council. Very excited today to welcome Francisco de Santibañes, the Director of the Argentine Council for International Relations, Global Fellow at the Wilson Center, here to speak with us about Latin America and everything that's going on there. It's an exciting conversation, but before we get to that, Nick, I want to ask you about two things that have been on my mind. One of which I actually got my students to really care about. They came into class saying, "We believe we are such a woke generation. We cannot believe what is happening at the Poland-Belarus border." Because in recent days, there have been more videos taken of the refugees at the border, in people dying at the border, and nobody really talking about it. I relate this back, and we mentioned it briefly in our last podcast with Parag Khanna when talking about migration. We touched on it briefly, but I think the situation is getting more dire. So a little bit of background. There have been airplanes coming from places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, funded by the government of Lukashenko in Belarus, bringing refugees to Belarus and explaining to them that they will get to Europe, and their way to Europe is being shoved to the border with Poland. Poland is, of course, turning these refugees back. They're getting in trouble with the European Union. But what picked me up on this, again, is that Poland is now talking about building a border wall. A border wall. Where does that rhetoric remind you of? And then in another article, I believe it was in Bloomberg, they called it the new Iron Curtain. Nick, are you getting weird flashbacks on so many different levels? What do you make of it?
I think it's an important point that dividing lines have returned. The idea that we are becoming a flatter world, a more open world, a world that is easier to travel. This is a rebuke to that, to say, nope, we're going to put a wall, we're going to make a border, we're going to say there's a difference to being on one side and on the other, and that if you're not on our side, we don't want you for a variety of reasons. But it also touches, I think, on some larger issues, and it's not just, it can be very easy just to say, well, this is somehow Polish particularism or just Eastern Europeans in general. This is touching on political issues and divisions around the world, that the us versus them, my country, who belongs in my country, who has a right to be in my country, are issues that are animating political movements in the United States, as you've noted, in India, all across the world. And something that I think we will be able to ask our guest in a few moments is the extent to which this is playing into the rise of a new type of conservative movement, which emphasizes particularism, which is against what it sees as globalizing elites that are trying to erase borders and erase distinctions. On the other hand, this also points to another issue, and what you have said about how these migrants have ended up in Belarus, which is not part of what you would expect as the natural route for people coming from the Middle East or from Afghanistan or sub-Saharan Africa to come to Belarus. And that is the weaponization of migration, which is that you have a government in Belarus which is under enormous pressure from within, which is facing sanctions from the European Union. And this is a way to use the movement of people as a weapon to create problems, right? To create problems within the EU, between other European countries and Poland, to create problems in Poland itself. And this may be a trend. Parag in our last podcast. So as you mentioned, Parag Hanna talked about the benefits of migration. He talked about that the future is going to be determined by this competition for human capital. But the dark side of what he discussed on the podcast and in the book, and what you're seeing on the border between Belarus and Poland, is the weaponization of how can this be turned as a tool of pressure and of intimidation and of coercion by saying, if you don't, we're going to, if you don't do certain things for us, we'll allow migrants and refugees to enter your territory from ours. So I think this really speaks to some of these issues to moving forward.
And we'll see how it plays out, especially as winter comes up and the situation, I'm expecting it to worsen. We'll keep following that story for you, our listeners. The other story we're following is we'll be talking about China, always talking about China with our guest as an economic force. But this week, China also took center stage as a military force, which sometimes we forget in this discussion of economic power. We forget that they are out there, and it came out just yesterday that they were testing hypersonic missiles over the summer. Nobody really talked about it in the summer, and now all of a sudden they said that it was General, I believe, was quoted saying that it was like a Sputnik moment. And how worried should we be about these hypersonic missiles, especially in relation to what we learned at our last book talk from Rose Gottelmeier about nuclear weapons and how to control them and manage them? China's outside of this rubric.
Yeah, I mean, Sputnik moment may be a bit over dramatic, because it's not as if this is a major new technological breakthrough. The technology for doing this has been around for a while, but it's China's ability to put it together and to show that it has these capabilities. What it does, I think, and where I think the comparison with Sputnik in 1957 is apt, is that it's a reminder to the United States that it's not the only country in the world that has impressive military technologies. And it's a reminder too, because the whole idea of these hypersonic delivery vehicles is they're designed to defeat missile defenses, because you launch it moves where it is. It's not on a fixed arc from launch to where it impacts, so it's harder to detect, it's harder to defend against. And we've talked with many of our doorstep guests about the sense of how prepared should the United States be to compete with China. This is a reminder that competition with China has costs. And I think that the Biden administration found this an unpleasant moment, because this is a reminder that if we're going to be competing with China, and as Americans are looking at China and saying we're going to compete with them, that there are costs and risks, that there's a point at which China can also compete with us. And so I think it's that unpleasant reminder that the United States does not just simply sit at the center and prevail in every moment. It also is going to highlight, I think, a question, and we're going to see this come up again and again about things like what does this mean for, as we saw with Sputnik in 1957, what does it mean for our educational institutions? How should we be paying for higher education? What type of higher education should we be paying for? What should we be encouraging students to do? Because again, what Sputnik did and what this is doing again is reminding you that you need engineers, you need scientists, you need technicians. That requires investment in education. It requires investments across the board. It also means that you have to, in encouraging people to go to college, you have to find a way to encourage people to study things that tie into the science and technological base. College for all is a great slogan, but college for all, for everyone to be a film major, may not produce the kind of outcomes that we're looking for. We're going to need chemists and physicists and mathematicians and engineers. And so how this will play out in our own domestic debate about, and as we're seeing now, paying for school, paying for education, we'll see how this develops. But it will also, I think, re-spark this doorstep conversation to some extent about at what point is it not in the interests of average Americans to always be competing with China? And it will reawaken the question that the Chinese first raised in the 1990s when we had the first series of crises on Taiwan. The United States saying, well, we're going to intervene here and there throughout Asia, but what are we willing to put at risk at home? Are we willing to trade New York for Taipei? And so that this hypersonic vehicle says that equation is back on the table.
And we'll see how China plays into our relationship in Latin America in just a moment. And I think all these salient issues will come up. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We here in the US are in election season. Next Tuesday, we have elections across the country, November 2nd. Here in New York, where I am, we have elections for mayor and lots of elections. And it got me to thinking, what's going on in the world with elections? And it got me to reading about the Brazilian election, which led me to your piece, Francisco, about popular conservatism rising in Latin America. And we here at the Doorstep try to link what is going on in the globe to what our citizens should be thinking about. And certainly the rise of conservatism is a big topic here. And there are even more and closer links as you lay out in your piece, and as we know. And just this month, CPAC here, so CPAC standing for the Conservative Political Action Conference, run here by the American Conservative Union, hosted a conference in Brazil, which had Donald Trump Jr. speaking remotely and really showed the connections between American conservatives and Brazilian conservatives that I don't think many of us here in the States are talking about enough. And so thank you today for coming and explaining what is going on. But I'd like to start with your piece. Popular conservatism rising in Latin America. You had 3 points. What is it? How is it shaping Latin American society? And is Bolsonaro the beginning of a new era? So if you could walk us through those 3 points to start off, that would be wonderful. So what is this idea of popular conservatism?
Yes, I think there is a new political movement, and you can see this not just in the US and Brazil, but in other countries. And what you're seeing is a new generation of leaders that are conservatives, that they support the traditional conservative agenda, but they are also profoundly anti-elitist. They attack the elites. You are familiar with that in the US, in the case of Trump, and not just Trump, I would say the Republican Party now, how it has changed in the last years. So Trump, for instance, against Hollywood, against the political elite in Washington, etc. And Bolsonaro is a similar case. So he defends traditional conservative values, but he has this characteristic that's different to previous conservatives in Brazil, as Trump is different to previous conservatives in the US. They are very violent in their attacks against the traditional establishment because they see it as too cosmopolitan, too urban, that doesn't represent anymore the values and the interests of the population. So you see a lot of similarities, not just between Bolsonaro and Trump, but Erdogan, Putin, and other leaders around the world.
I'll add one to that, because the next CPAC conference is supposed to be in Hungary. So
Exactly.
Arban as well. How is this movement tied together by CPAC? Do you see a lot of activity, even where you are in Argentina?
I would say that the important story is not CPAC per se, but the links between these conservatives. And there are many. There is a profound admiration in the case of Bolsonaro and his supporters of, especially about Trump. No, not necessarily the Republican Party as we knew it, but this new Republican Party. And if you see, they have similar supporters. For instance, the evangelical churches that are very important in Brazil. It's a traditional Catholic country, but in the last years, the evangelical movement has grown a lot. And it's very similar to the support they provide to the Republican Party in the US. No? It's one of the main electors in primaries in the US of the Republican Party are the evangelical movement. It's the same in Brazil with Bolsonaro. It's a very close allies. They are very close allies to Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro also has the support of the military. Bolsonaro comes from the Brazilian army and from the countryside. No? And there are some similarity there also with the Republican Party that's stronger, not in the big cities, but maybe in the rest of the countries. Well, Bolsonaro has more problems winning elections in big cities. So as you can see, there are many similarities.
What I think this points to, and both your article and as our conversation is evolving, is first the idea that Donald Trump in the United States was just simply an aberration and a one-time happening. This suggests, as you've mentioned, and as Tatiana's questions have pointed out, that there is in fact a global network of leaders and political movements that share this orientation. And as you said, and I think this has very important ramifications for foreign policy and international affairs. You said that it is directed against what it sees as a cosmopolitan elite. It stands against globalization, or the idea that from Hong Kong to Houston to Havana, eventually the world is moving towards a sort of a single culture, single set of values. This is a movement that preaches particularism in each country, is suspicious of globalization, is suspicious of international organizations. And so from what you're saying here, it sounds like what you're suggesting is this is a movement which is going to continue to have ramifications in the 2020s in the domestic politics of a variety of countries, including those in Latin America, but also in Europe, in North America, in Asia as well. So do you see kind of the staying power of these ideas? Perhaps not, as you said, in the big cities, but there appear to now to be constituencies around the world for this type of populist conservatism, conservative appeal to conservative social values, but not necessarily supporters of economic globalization across borders.
I totally agree. And I give you two examples, one of the past and one of the present. One is Brexit, no? The speech of the supporters of Brexit was to go against the elites in Brussels, no? That didn't represent the interests of the British people, and against immigration. It's the same rhetoric. And another, has happened in the last weeks, no? But you will have an election in Chile, and there was a lot of discussion. I'm sure you read it in the newspapers about new constitutions and the revolt against the establishment. But what happened in the last 2 weeks is there is a new candidate that comes from the new right, similar, an admirer of Trump and Bolsonaro. He's called Cast, and now he's leading the polls. So it's a popular conservative, and a couple of weeks has taken the right by himself. No? So the traditional conservative libertarian parties that ruled the center-right camp in Chile disappear. It's similar to Bolsonaro, Trump, that no one was expecting them. No? I remember no one expected Trump to win the primaries in the Republican Party. It was crazy. And then no one expected him to win the elections, and he won. He almost won the re-election against what most people believe. And Bolsonaro was similar. He was a very marginal representative in the House in Brasilia, and most people thought he was crazy, but he won the election. So this is something that happened in other cases. No? In a short period of time, you have a new candidate with this speech who collaborates with other popular conservatives, and they do a very good use of social networks. That's another characteristic. And they are very competitive in electoral terms.
Let me ask, and thank you for bringing up Chile, because I think one of the things we want to do is not lump all the countries in Latin America together, but really to distinguish characteristics and what's going on in each. We have now Biden in almost a year. Have you seen a change in his foreign policy towards Latin America? And how has some of what him and his administration done to support more popular democratic movements in Latin America? Or maybe they aren't. I was just looking, by the way, at the list of ambassadors, and 50% of ambassadors positions from America to other countries aren't filled, including to Brazil and other important Latin American countries. So does the US still have a voice in Latin America?
I think rhetoric has changed. For sure, there is more focus on human rights, for instance, and it was not the case with Trump. But I will say that the main concern is China. China is becoming a major player in the region, especially in the southern countries, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay. It's the main trade partner of these countries. It's the nation that has more resources to offer, for instance, in terms of infrastructure development. So I would say that American foreign policy with Trump and now with Biden, of course, with many differences, but its main goal is China, the main preoccupation. Of course, there are other realities, different relations with the Caribbean countries, Central America, because of immigration. That's a major concern also because of domestic politics in the US. But overall, with the big countries, Argentina, Brazil, even Mexico, there is a growing focus on China's presence in the region and how to compete with China in terms of, for instance, there is a new American program that has to do with providing funds for infrastructure. Remember that many countries in the region have already signed the One Road initiative of China. The big one have not, and that's an issue of concerns of the US. The US doesn't want these countries to get to adopt, for instance, 5G Chinese technology. The US doesn't want Latin American countries to be part of the One Belt, One Road initiative. So I will say what you are seeing in the last years is that major change. There is also immigration, climate change, but the main concerns, in my view, is China's presence.
I think that's a great example. So I have a colleague who is now doing business in Colombia, going outsourcing. And, Colombia and the American have had traditionally a long history, a lot of foreign direct investment, a lot of support. And he thinks that Colombia is just the best country to do business. And yet I was looking at the numbers, and China from out of nowhere is now Colombia's #2 trading partner. And so to your point, has the US been proactive enough against some of the work that China's done, even in terms of providing vaccines? let's not forget we're still in the middle of a pandemic. I know that numbers in Latin America are going down, but we still are in a global pandemic. Has China been able to make inroads over this last year because of their providing vaccines, et cetera, and more support?
I think at the beginning of the pandemic, some countries, and I would say Russia, at least in the case of Argentina, was more active than the US, selling vaccines while the US was providing vaccines to American population and not exporting them. But after a period of time, the US has been quite active donating vaccines throughout the region. I think it's by far the main player in that sense. But I would say the US has an advantage that in terms of values, most people will feel closer to the US than to China, not necessarily to American government. But the US still has an advantage in terms of soft power. That's for sure. The thing is, it takes time to develop a strategy, I think, and a rhetoric that works. No? Sometimes it seems to me that the US uses a rhetoric that's quite similar to the one used during the Cold War. And it's not necessarily the same, no? Because Latin American countries felt threatened, societies, the elites, of a Soviet presence because of communism. No? You have the church, the private sector, that they are fighting for their life if the communists are right. But it's not the same with China. China's elite seems to see China as a more pragmatic player. So maybe it's more difficult for the US to develop a rhetoric in this competition with China in Latin America, because we don't feel as threatened by the Chinese as we felt with the Soviet. In Asia, it's different because Asian countries really feel threatened by the Chinese in terms of security. But each region has a different reality, I think. And because we are far away from China and the relation is mostly economic, I don't perceive that there is that sense of threat.
Well, and I think that raises an interesting point, going back to your discussion about the rise of populist conservatives in the region, in that one, you don't have this sense of existential threat from China. It's a pragmatic relationship. One of the things that does seem to mark these political leaders and movements is they're much more transactional. They're willing to bargain if they can see and they can show a benefit. At the same time, because of this emphasis on distrust of cosmopolitanism and globalization and elites that appear to be anti-national, which is part of the rhetoric we hear so often, that this may create a problem for a specific US administration, in this case, the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, which is seen in its foreign policy as wanting to, as you said, promote human rights, but promote human rights which include a whole groups and categories that popular conservatives would say strike at the family, strike at traditional religious organizations, gender relations, and the like. So is there a risk that you might see that if this movement, if these movements gain more traction in Latin America, and you have a United States, which on the one hand is saying, or a Biden administration, which is saying on the one hand, we have China, please join us against the Chinese threat, which Latin America doesn't feel. And on the other hand, the United States is perceived as wanting to change. And this, of course, is a big part of Viktor Orban's appeal in Hungary, that the United States and European cosmopolitan elites want to change our national culture. Do you see down the road we can end up with some degree of dysfunction between the United States and governments in Latin America that will be run by or where popular conservatives will have taken power?
Yes, I think it's possible, and you see that in case of Bolsonaro, who who is clearly in favor of Trump, no? And against Biden. No? And the other thing to consider is that the Chinese say that they don't care about what happened inside a country. No? They just provide assistance. They don't promote, at least they say that they don't promote specific regime. They don't promote a human rights agenda. So in that sense, if you have leaders that are more transactional, they may feel closer to the Chinese, what the Chinese are offering. So it's a good point. I think it's a possibility, and we are starting to see that. We saw a government with Bolsonaro that was very close to Trump, but with the change of administration, things changed, both in DC, because of course there's animosity from certain progressive sectors of the Democratic Party towards Bolsonaro because of climate change, because of human rights. And it's the same thing in Brazil. No? There are certain conservative sectors that see Biden as a rival of Bolsonaro and promoting a social agenda that goes against their values and their interests.
So, since you mentioned climate, and that's kind of the elephant in the room as COP26 begins this weekend, and we should talk a little bit about it. What do you see coming out of this conference for Latin America? Is there something specific that, an agenda that you feel can be embraced, or do you feel that it's a kind of a Western agenda being imposed on some Latin American countries?
I would say there is a consensus among elites and the population that climate change is a big issue. No? So there is a support of this agenda. What may happen in the near future is that you start to see some kind of rejection when the population start to feel the pain of the measures Latin American countries have to adopt to collaborate in this fight. No? That's what you saw, for instance, in France. No? If you remember, Macron passed a reform to increase the taxes of oil for the buses, the cars, etc. No? And that's what provoked the reaction against Macron, no? The yellow belts. There was a complaint because you have these people in Paris, far away from the population, that they don't understand that outside the big cities, people spend a lot of money in their cars because they don't have public transportation. So I think you may start to see a similar phenomenon, not just in Latin America, but in other developing countries. No? That you have to increase taxes, or you have to go against some sectors of the economy, and that will raise rejection. And you cannot see that yet because there is a gap between a government is in favor of some changes and everyone agrees because global warming is bad, but then when you have to pay the bill, you will start to see some problems. Maybe the danger there is that Latin American governments go against this commitment. So this may start to happen in 1-2 years from now. It's what happened in France, but also in the US. No? I think Trump had a lot of support from sectors of the economy or even states that didn't agree with a drastic change, for instance, in how we produce energy.
So let's go back to elections then, and how elections can change on a dime. Steve Bannon, Trump advisor, who now runs the movement, which supports some of this conservatism that we're talking about, said this election, i.e. the Brazilian election, is the second most important election in the world and the most important election in South America. Bolsonaro will win unless it's stolen by the machines. And so here we go, the same rhetoric used now, still today, here in the US, being picked up and promoted there. What is your commentary on this idea of, using this stolen election rhetoric? How dangerous is that? Is it working in Brazil? Is it exportable to other countries in Latin America? This idea of stolen elections.
It may be, and it will be very dangerous for our societies, because as a result of this trust against the elites, that's what you see in the polls in Latin America. It has increased a lot because the economies don't grow, and we suffer a lot from the pandemic. The political system is polarized. So you have presidents, if you compare to what happened in Latin America 10, 20 years ago, you have presidents that are farther to the left or farther to the right, in different countries. And the dialogue, reaching consensus, both within countries and between countries in the regions, has become more difficult because of this. So if you introduce to that situation the idea that you are stalling elections, it can be very dangerous. Remember that we used to have military governments, for many times. So it's not the same than the US that has a long institutional tradition, and no one will think about that possibility. We have a different history, and in that context, I think it will be much more dangerous than in the US, that kind of rhetoric.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
No, I think that's a very critical point that you've raised, and it's an important lesson, I think, for Americans here, that it's very easy to throw around this rhetoric, as you said, well, the election was stolen, I didn't like the outcome, but how it erodes trust, and that it does, if the institutions weaken, then over time you are prey to where elections no longer are seen as a way in which power is legitimately granted or transferred. And so I think, as you said, that Latin America's history, where questions about the validity of elections or election results being overturned by force is part of the political history. It may behoove Americans who are very casual with throwing around things like election fraud and stolen election to take a minute to see how very corrosive this is to the continuity of liberal democracy. But Tatiana, you were going to continue?
No, it actually continues on from your point. Another erosion is, of course, freedom of the press. I think it goes hand in hand with, to have a strong democracy, I believe you have to have a strong press. Of course, my bias is I'm a journalist, so I believe that. But how has, if at all, the press suffered or been supported by this change and this movement to popular conservatism? Are the press in Latin America being vilified, targeted as much as they are here in the US?
I would say 2 points. The one is technological change, because of the social networks, journalists have lost power. You don't have anymore, or it doesn't have the power it used to have, the editors, for instance, that they could choose which news was true, which one was false, or what kind of opinion is valid or not. No? So now it's open to any kind of rhetoric. That's one point that has weakened traditional journalism. And at the other point, and you saw that in Argentina in the past, with Bolsonaro, is that they tend to identify traditional media outlets, newspapers, TV stations, to the ruling elites. So, for instance, Trump did that with the New York Times. Bolsonaro did that with the O Globo Group. It's the main media group in Brazil. And you see this with other popular conservatives around the world. So it has been an important issue. I don't see examples of big Latin American countries where you have violence against journalists. Colombia may be an exception, but because of its history, and it's a different story. But at least I don't see that in Chile and Argentina and Brazil. There you still have freedom of expression and independent media. But of course, that can change. So I agree with you. It's important to give importance to that subject and the dangers the media faces.
And one of my passions also is to look at how the youth, how Gen Z, we call it here, we talk about Gen Z a lot. You have your own Gen Z. How are they swinging? You know, what direction? Are they more conservative, more socialist? We have a lot of anti-socialism rhetoric here. Even here where I am in New York City, we have stop socialism political signs, believe it or not. So how are Generation Z in Latin America, and what do you expect of them?
It's very interesting because I would say that in some countries, what you're starting to see is that they're moving to the right, the younger generation. One example is in Argentina. We had elections a few weeks ago, and you had a new candidate that came from the right, and he won among the youth voters in the city of Buenos Aires, and that was a surprise, and it's in the media, in the social networks, like an important development, because as in many countries, we tend to think that the youth tends to be more progressive. But I think it has to do with the rejection of the elites. If the youth believes that the elites are left-wing now, are more progressive, they will move to the right, to be anti-establishment. And this is part of the rhetoric of these candidates. We are anti-establishment, and the establishment is a social progressive, elite, and we should go against them. And you're starting to see that having some success among younger voters.
Oh, interesting. But what about issues such as social issues, though? You know, you have perhaps it's anti-establishment, because they feel that, the elites are too progressive. But is that really true for social issues like abortion or issues, like climate? And, I feel like maybe that parsing of issues, needs to be discussed too, or is it really based on just this blanket statement, anti-establishment?
No, I agree. In issues such as abortion and climate change, the new generations tend to be more progressive in their views. In those particular subjects. You have had some changes. In the case of abortion in Argentina, it has become legal. That's a big change. But in most countries, you still have a majority against that agenda. And again, you have a very active evangelical movement similar to the US, that's playing an important part in politics. So you don't see, you may say even that the Catholic Church with the new Pope, that's a Latin American, an Argentine, Francis, have adopted more progressive views, but the evangelicals have not. So maybe the ones who are playing the most important role in that political fight are the evangelicals. And Bolsonaro is an example. He has adopted that agenda. He's quite active, but you also see it in other countries. So that has been an important change. You don't have a more secular societies, with some exceptions. Chile may be one, but you have societies that are where you have fewer Catholics and more evangelicals. And that's having an important political effect, as it happened in the US, from what I have read, but the rise of the Republican Party with Reagan in part was because the evangelicals get involved in politics. And it was very important for the Republican Party in the southern states and to win presidential elections. But there is a similarity about that in Latin America.
I think that I learned something from that today, because typically we traditionally see Latin America as quite Catholic, and so it's so interesting to see this new movement and this worldwide movement and the global connections. I have my last question though is about what you mentioned several times, this rise of digital media, allowing people to speak with each other. Here in the US, there's a Facebook reckoning going on. We have the Facebook papers published, and every day there's more and more stories. We're certainly probably looking at, my prediction is before the end of the year, some sort of regulation against social media companies. Are you finding the same backlash against social media companies in Latin America, or are they kind of, it's a free for all? I mean, how would you describe the situation there?
I would say I don't see a rejection. One interesting point when we were discussing China and the US is that we're talking about American companies. No? We use Twitter, Facebook, Google. So it's interesting to think if that could have some effect, some consequence in relations with the United States. No? Because if there is a rejection that I have not seen so far, but may happen, will be against American companies. So you may have a diplomatic matter there in the near future. Because in Russia and China, you have domestic social media companies. There's a rejection to the American influence. But it's not the case in Latin America. So I would say almost all the market is controlled by American social media companies.
And the Chinese companies haven't really made much inroads. So people don't switch from Twitter to Weibo, and they're not switching from Facebook to VKontakte or anything. They're still sticking with the US platforms. And I think, as you said, that is an interesting development, because perhaps that's still means that Latin America stays within the US conversation, so to speak, rather than being part of the Chinese or the Russian ones.
Oh, it's the same. The social media, the movies, Netflix. Netflix is, everyone watches Netflix or Amazon Prime. You don't have a presence of the Chinese media or the Russian media. You haven't seen that so far. There is a discussion about 5G technology.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah,
that's another thing.
Yeah, the technological side, but the content side, and that actually maybe to close out, we've talked about the United States and Latin America as if they are, in essence, two separate entities. But of course, the United States is an important part of the Spanish-speaking world. Increasingly, cultural products, soft power products in both English and Spanish go back and forth. Is there a sense that you're seeing that as we move forward into the 2020s, that there's going to be more of a sense that at least communities or parts of the United States, you certainly already see this in Miami and South Florida, the idea that being part of a single community in the hemisphere may become more important for Americans who traditionally have seen the Rio Grande as a very defined border between cultural spaces. Is there a sense that more interaction and influence back and forth throughout the hemisphere, and driven by the Spanish language increasingly as more Americans use it, and as more cultural products come from Spanish-speaking artists who then are both fluent in both English and Spanish and can cross that? Are you seeing any rejuvenate, or a question of this kind of soft power that develops from that, not just simply that people are Netflix, but that they are jointly producing content which is then being enjoyed both in North and South America and Central America in the middle.
I think so. We have been discussing about nation states, but also civil society is quite active. I think relations between Americans and Latin Americans are closer than ever, and this has a lot to do with the Latino influence in the US. It's an important part of the population. So I think culturally and socially, that's an important and positive development. But I would also add the political influence of the Latin population in the US and how does that affect American foreign policy. For instance, Trump won Florida in the last election. It was a surprise, or was a difficult state to win. And in part it was because of his foreign policy towards Venezuela. You have important Venezuelan community as a Cuban community, and that the kind of rhetoric that the Trump administration and the policies it implemented toward Cuba and Venezuela was very important in electoral terms. And it's the same with the Democrats and other Latino communities. So what you may see is a growing interest in the perceptions Latin American countries have, also because of domestic reasons, electoral reasons. And that may be good also.
Well, we are going to see as we ourselves head into the important 2024 election, and hopefully we can have you back for more commentary. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.